The morning of the wedding, the church bells of St. Edmund's rang 9 times over the frosted fields of Wiltshire, and no one who heard them spared a thought for the woman standing at the lych gate. She wore gray, not the soft silver gray of morning silk, but the hard gray of a garment washed too many seasons running, the color of stone walls in rain. Her bonnet was brown, the ribbon frayed at one end, the brim slightly dipped where water had warped the stiffening. She carried no basket, no letter, no calling card. She stood with her hands folded at her waist and looked at the church door as though she had looked at a great many church doors in her time, and found that looking was the only thing she was still permitted to do. The village had assembled, as villages do, for the spectacle of a grand wedding. The church of St. Edmund's Knighton sat at the end of a long lane of sycamore, and the sycamores were bare, and the light between them was the pale gold particular to November mornings when the frost has not yet lifted. Lady Cecilia Windborne was to marry Mr. Gerald Hartfield that day. Everyone said so. The Hartfield fortune was considerable, the Windborne connections were impeccable, and the union had been arranged with the precision of a siege. The elder Mrs. Hartfield, Gerald's mother, whose opinions arrived before she did, and lingered longer after, had pronounced it the most suitable match the county had seen in 20 years. The county had not argued. No one argued with Mrs. Hartfield. It was one of the settled facts of Wiltshire. The woman at the lych gate did not move when the first carriages turned into the lane. She stood aside as they passed, pressed against the stone pillar, with the habitual economy of a person long accustomed to making herself small in the presence of those who did not expect her to take up space. The footman on the first carriage glanced at her. The couple inside did not. It was Edmund Hartfield who saw her first. He was the groom's elder brother, and he was not, strictly speaking, supposed to be attending his brother's wedding at all. He had arrived the previous evening on roads made treacherous by the first hard frost of the season, and he had said very little at supper, and he had looked at the table setting for 13 guests with an expression that suggested he was calculating the precise social cost of every available choice. He sat now in the last carriage, alone, because that was the arrangement his mother had made, and because he had long since learned that her arrangements had the force of property law. He saw the woman at the lych gate, and he did not look away. She did not see him. Her eyes were on the church door, and they were steady, and they did not fill with anything so easy as tears. She had the kind of face that had been composed by a very specific and extended form of endurance, not beautiful in the diamond-bright way of the season's favorites, but arresting in the way that things are which have been stripped to their essential quality. Cheekbones fine and sharp under pale skin, eyes the brown of autumn water in a stone-lined channel, intelligent and very still. Hands she held folded because they were bare, no gloves in November, the hands of a woman for whom gloves had become a luxury some months since. Edmund Hartfield did not speak. He had no reason to speak to the woman at the lych gate. He stepped from the carriage and followed the other guests through the church door. And he sat in the second pew and watched his brother stand at the altar. And something moved in his chest that he had not allowed to move in 3 years, and he did not name it. And he watched the church door. She did not come in. Her name was Marian Hartfield, and she was the groom's abandoned wife. If you have stayed this far, stay a little longer. What is about to be uncovered took 8 years to bury, and will not resolve itself quickly, or cleanly, or without cost. It will resolve. The marriage, the first one, the one that produced the name she still carried and the ring she did not wear, had taken place in Edinburgh, in the August of 1807, when Gerald Hartfield was 22 and Marian Ashbrook was 19. She had been the daughter of a Scottish solicitor, respectable and comfortable, not wealthy. Gerald had been passing through on his way north to visit a school friend, and she had been introduced at a supper, and he had been charming in the particular way that men are charming when they are young and self-certain and have not yet been required to demonstrate their character in any situation that mattered. He had courted her with speed and conviction. He had married her on the 2nd of August, in a church neither his family nor hers had ever entered, before 2 witnesses who were neither kin nor connection of either party. He had been gone by the 1st of September. The letter arrived 6 weeks later. It was short. He had reviewed his circumstances, he wrote, and found that the marriage had been contracted in a moment of feeling unsuited to his family's expectations and his own long-term prospects, and he trusted she would understand that the necessary steps would be taken to address the matter discreetly. There were no steps. The letter had been the last communication. The marriage had not been annulled because annulment required witnesses and a process and a record. And Gerald Hartfield did not want any of those things. It had not been dissolved because the law of England dissolved very little that a man of Gerald's station wished, dissolved only quietly, and after the fact. The marriage had simply been deposited somewhere at the bottom of 8 years' silence, and Gerald had returned to Wiltshire and eventually agreed to the match with Lady Cecilia. And the wedding date had been set, and the church hired, and the guests assembled. And no one in Wiltshire had ever heard the name Marian Ashbrook at all. Marian had not advertised it. She had her reasons for reticence, and they were not what people might have assumed. She was not afraid of Gerald. She was not broken, or spiritless, or waiting to be rescued. She had spent 8 years moving carefully through the available positions, open to a woman whose marriage existed in law, but not in practice, whose husband lived openly in society, while she made do in its margins. She had been a schoolmistress in Edinburgh for 2 years. She had been a lady's companion in Shrewsbury for 3. She had come to Wiltshire 6 months since to serve as a reading teacher to the children of a local curate, because the position paid a livable sum, and because she had received reliable word that Gerald Hartfield was to be married in November, and she had determined, in the quiet way she determined things, that she would be present. Not to interrupt. Not to claim anything dramatic. To be present, as a fact, in the vicinity of the fact being enacted in her name. She was, after all, still his wife. She had not ceased to be so because he had ceased to acknowledge it. The curate's wife, Mrs. Poole, called her simply the schoolmistress, and thought her quiet and capable and somewhat overeducated for the position. The curate himself had noticed that she read Latin and had once found her correcting an error in his own transcription of a passage from St. Augustine, which he had filed away as a curiosity and not examined further. Neither of them knew her married name. She did not use it. Edmund Hartfield knew it. He had known it for 4 months, since a solicitor named Carver in Edinburgh had written to him with information that had required 3 readings before its meaning had settled fully into his understanding. He had told no one. He had come to the wedding with the kind of specific intention that men carry when they have decided to allow a thing to play itself out to its end before acting. And he had sat in the second pew and watched Gerald stand at the altar, and he had watched the church door. She did not come in. She stood at the lych gate in the November cold, and she looked at the door, and she did not cross the threshold because she had not come to destroy anything. She had come only to be a fact. The first time the dismissive label was spoken aloud, it was spoken by Mrs. Hartfield. She said it at the wedding breakfast, in the high-ceilinged dining room of Hartfield Park, where 60 guests sat at a table set with silver candlesticks and late chrysanthemums in cream and white. A footman had mentioned in passing that one of the village women had been seen loitering at the church in the morning. Mrs. Hartfield had set down her glass with the controlled precision of a woman whose opinions were always preceded by a small physical performance of their inevitability. "A beggar, most probably," she said. "We shall have them at every occasion if we continue to permit it. The village has grown very lax about its unfortunate persons." The table heard this and moved on, as tables do. Edmund Hartfield, seated at his mother's right hand, did not move on. He cut his pheasant with precision and said nothing, and the candle light was warm on the silver. And across the room his brother Gerald was laughing at something his new bride had said. And Edmund looked at his pheasant and thought about a letter from a solicitor in Edinburgh, and thought about a woman in a grey dress standing at a lich gate in the frost with bare hands, and something that had been solid in his chest for 3 years developed, very quietly, a flaw. He had been 3 years a widower himself. His wife Georgiana had died in the winter of 1811, of a fever that had arrived on a Thursday and been finished by a Sunday, and she had been 27 years old, and they had been married 4 years, and he had loved her with the steadiness that is not spoken of much because it is not dramatic, the steadiness of a man who had organized his entire interior landscape around one person's continued existence, and found it, afterward, not quite navigable. He had been capable since. Capable and careful, and very correct in all his dealings, and not, in 3 years, moved by any particular person to feel anything he had not carefully permitted himself to feel in advance. He was not being careful now. He found her the following morning. She was in the lane behind the church, walking toward the curate's house with a bundle of primers under her arm, and the frost had not lifted, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and she did not see him until he was close enough that turning away would have required a deliberateness she apparently found beneath her. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not yet anything at all. "Miss Ashbrook," he said. Her expression did not change. "You have the advantage of me, sir," she said, which was a period formula meaning he knew something she had not given him, and she said it evenly and without heat. "Edmund Hartfield," he said. "You know my brother." A pause. Not long. She had very good control of her face, and what moved across it was not fear, but something more considered, the expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular conversation for a considerable time and is now deciding how to begin it. "I have that distinction," she said at last. He did not flinch at the tone. "I have a letter," he said, "from a solicitor in Edinburgh named Carver. I believe you know of him." The bundle of primers shifted in her arms slightly. "Walk with me," he said. And it came out as a command, level and without apology, and she looked at him for a moment with the frank assessment of a woman accustomed to deciding very quickly which commands were worth obeying. She walked with him. He told her what he knew. He told it plainly, without softening, because he had decided that softening would be an insult to the kind of intelligence she was evidently applying to the situation. He told her that the Edinburgh solicitor had been retained by her father's estate some years before, and had maintained the record of the marriage as a matter of professional duty, and that when the Hartfield engagement to Lady Cecilia had been announced in the newspapers, Carver had written to the eldest Hartfield brother as a matter of law and conscience, and that Edmund had spent 4 months deciding what to do with what he had been told. "And what have you decided?" she asked. "I have not decided anything," he said. "I came to determine whether what I intended to do was what you wished to have done. Those are different matters." She stopped walking. She looked at him with the directness of someone who had been spoken to in evasions and circumlocutions for 8 years and was recalibrating to plain language. "What is it you intend?" she said. "To ensure that the marriage my brother contracted in Edinburgh in the year 1807 is made known to the appropriate persons," he said, "which would render yesterday's ceremony void, which would expose my brother to a considerable amount of scrutiny he has not previously experienced, which would do a number of things to my mother's reputation that I have spent the walk from the church calculating, and will not enumerate here, and which would restore to you what was taken from you without your consent and without remedy." He paused. "I am asking," he said, "whether you want it." She was quiet for a long time. The lane was empty. A rook called somewhere in the bare sycamores. "You are asking," she said slowly, "whether I want the truth told." "I am asking," he said, "whether the consequences of the truth are consequences you are prepared to live with. The truth is not the difficulty. The aftermath is." She looked at him for a moment with something that might, in a different face, have been gratitude. But in hers was more complex, because she had learned long since not to spend gratitude on things she had not yet received. "Mr. Hartfield," she said, "I have been living with consequences for 8 years. I am not afraid of them." He nodded once and said nothing more on the subject, and they walked on in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and the frost lay on the lane, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air. And he watched them, without meaning to. The second time the dismissive label was spoken, it was in public, and it was worse. Mrs. Hartfield held a small dinner 3 days after the wedding for the county neighbors who had been unable to attend the larger breakfast. It was a dinner of 20, and it included the vicar, who was old and particular, and Colonel Pemberton, who was new to the neighborhood and ambitious, and 3 ladies whose collective function in the county was the management of its reputations. Edmund attended. Marian did not attend, because she had not been invited, because she was the curate's schoolmistress and not a dinner guest, because she was in every social calculation a person who did not cross these thresholds. She was mentioned, however. Mrs. Pemberton had seen her in the lane. Mrs. Pemberton described her to the table with the particular fluency of a woman who has found a subject that flatters her own position by contrast. She described the gray dress. She described the frayed bonnet ribbon. She noted that the woman had been observed near the church on the morning of the wedding and had been standing there for some time with no apparent purpose and no apparent invitation. "A beggar of some kind," said Mrs. Hartfield, who had already said this, and was pleased to have the opportunity to say it again, this time to a larger audience. "Or a woman with something she wished to say, and no means of saying it," said Edmund, from the end of the table. The table stilled. It was not that Edmund Hartfield was given to contradiction. He was given to silence. His contributions to his mother's dinner tables over the course of his adult life had been reliably minimal. And when he did speak, it was with a precision that his mother had always read as endorsement of whatever she had just said, because precision and agreement had always felt, to her, like the same thing. "I beg your pardon," she said. "There are women," he said, in the same level register, "who stand at a distance from their own situation for some time before they are given the standing to speak to it directly. I should not assume such a woman is a beggar. I should assume she is waiting for the appropriate moment." A silence of a different kind settled over the table. Mrs. Hartfield smiled, which was the social form her displeasure took when witnesses were present. "How very poetic, Edmund," she said. "You always did have a literary turn. More wine, Colonel Pemberton?" Edmund looked at his glass and said nothing further, and the dinner moved on, and no one could quite say afterward what had been meant. But several people filed the moment away as a thing that might become significant with context, which is how the country's social machinery prefaced every significant event. A quiet unease that no one yet had the language to articulate. Marian, in the curate's house that evening, was reading aloud to the curate's daughter from a volume of natural history, and the fire was low, and the child was nearly asleep, and Marian sat in the small chair by the grate and felt, without quite knowing why, that something was about to shift. She had spoken with Edmund Hartfield twice more since the lane. Once at the gate of the church, briefly, where he had told her that he had written again to Carver in Edinburgh and expected a reply within the fortnight. Once at the edge of the village green, where he had come upon her mending a split in the curate's fence with a borrowed mallet and a spare post, and had looked at this for a long moment with an expression she could not read. A quality of stillness in him that she had come to recognize as the way he processed things he had not anticipated, and had taken the mallet without asking, and finished the work, driving the post true with a patience that suggested he had done such work before, and did not consider it beneath him, and had handed the mallet back, and said, "You should not be doing that alone," and she had said, "I do most things alone," and he had said nothing in reply. But he had not left immediately, and they had stood in the low afternoon light for an interval she declined to measure. She was not certain what she felt about Edmund Hartfield. She was certain that the feeling was there, in the body's unnegotiable accounting, the warmth that rose in her face when he spoke directly to her, the awareness of exactly how far away he stood when they were in a room together, the way her hands stilled when she heard his step. She had been careful with herself for 8 years. She had become very good at care. She was finding it harder lately. Edmund was finding nothing easier. He had not permitted himself to examine the situation in the terms it deserved until the night after the fence, when he had sat in the library of Hartfield Park and looked at the portrait of Georgiana that hung above the mantelpiece, and found, for the first time in 3 years, that looking at it produced in him something other than the flat gray grief he had mistaken for the end of all feeling. He felt the grief. It was still there. And yet there was something else present in the same chest. Something that did not diminish Georgiana and did not pretend she had not existed and did not offer itself as replacement for anything at all. It was simply there, specific and inconvenient and undeniable. And it had the face of a woman in a gray dress who mended fences alone and carried Latin primers through November frost and had been betrayed in the most fundamental way by a member of his own family. He had reached into his breast pocket and found the letter from Carver there, worn at the fold from the number of times he had read it, and he had looked at the portrait of Georgiana, and then at the letter, and then at the fire. And he had understood, with the quiet clarity of a man who had been deceiving himself carefully for several weeks, that his motivation for pressing this matter was not only justice, it was not only justice at all. The letter from Carver arrived 10 days after the wedding, and it arrived not at Hartfield Park, but at the curate's house, addressed to Marian in the solicitor's careful hand. Edmund had arranged this. He had not told her he had arranged it, because arranging things without announcement was the mode of a man who had learned that announcement invited interference. And there were persons at Hartfield Park whose interference he did not want in this. Marian read the letter at the kitchen table twice, then folded it precisely along its original creases, and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cloth. The letter confirmed what she had always known to be true. The Edinburgh marriage was recorded. The record was unimpeachable. Carver had retained the registration certificate, the banns, and the signatures of the 2 witnesses, a haberdasher named McCrae and a shipping clerk named Doward, both still living and both willing to attest. The marriage between Gerald Hartfield and Marian Ashbrook on the 2nd of August, 1807, was valid in law and had never been dissolved. Gerald's ceremony with Lady Cecilia on the 14th of November, 1815, was therefore void. She sat with this for a long time. Then she wrote a short note, addressed it to Edmund Hartfield, sealed it, and gave it to the curate's boy to carry to the park. Edmund came that evening. He sat across from her at the small kitchen table, because the curate and Mrs. Poole were visiting a neighboring parish, and the house was quiet. And she poured 2 cups of tea, because it was the most ordinary thing available to them in a situation that was not ordinary at all. The teapot was chipped. The cups were plain white. She noticed this and thought briefly, with a wry interior edge, that 8 years ago she had married a man at a similar table, and the plainness of the table had seemed, at the time, like honesty. "What do you want to do?" he said, without preamble, because he had learned by now that she preferred without preamble. "I want it corrected," she said. "I did not come here to destroy Lady Cecilia, or to punish Gerald, or to make anyone's life small. And yet I am a married woman being treated as no one, and the marriage exists, and it should be known to exist." He nodded. "I want it done quietly, if it can be done quietly," she said. "And I want it done properly, if it cannot." "It cannot be done quietly," he said. "My mother will ensure that. She will not receive the truth quietly, and she will not allow it to remain contained." "No," Marian agreed. "She will not." They were silent for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the bare sycamores moved against the last pale strip of light at the horizon. "There is a difficulty," he said, with a care she had come to recognize as the way he handled things he found personally difficult to say. "In the process of addressing the legal question, your situation will become very publicly known. You will be scrutinized. The county will form its opinions, and some of those opinions will be unflattering to you, because the county has a habit of distributing blame in ways that favor the established party." "I know that," she said. "I want you to know," he said, and stopped. The stop was brief, but it was visible. "I want you to know that I intend to make the situation clear in terms that cannot be misread. That you were the wronged party. That the concealment was Gerald's doing, and no one else's. That you came to Wiltshire because you had a right to come, and because you chose to stand in the cold at a lich gate rather than interrupt a ceremony you had every legal standing to interrupt, because that is the kind of person you are." She looked at him. His face was composed in the way it was always composed, the jaw held steady, the eyes direct. And yet there was something behind the composure now that had not been there 3 weeks ago, or that had been there, and she had not permitted herself to read. "That is very precise advocacy," she said, and meant it. "It is accurate advocacy," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at her tea. He looked at his. Outside, the wind. Inside, the chipped teapot, and the 2 plain cups, and the small warm kitchen of the curate's house, and the letter from Edinburgh folded between them on the table. "Edmund," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both heard it, and neither of them addressed it directly. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. He did not accept this with the easy grace of a man accustomed to gratitude. He received it the way he received most things of weight, in silence, with a slight tension in the set of his mouth that meant he was keeping something carefully in place. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "Wait until after the dinner." The dinner was Mrs. Hartfield's weekly entertainment for the neighborhood, held on the 2nd Thursday of the month, and it was attended by everyone who mattered in the immediate county and several people who were merely aspiring to matter. Edmund had arranged with Carver to be present. He had arranged with Mr. Poole, the curate, who was also in attendance, for a quiet word with the vicar. He had not arranged anything with Marian because she had not been invited, and because the arrangement he had made with himself on the subject of Marian was not one he was prepared to articulate until he had done what needed to be done, and she was in a position to hear it. The third time the dismissive label was spoken aloud, it was spoken by Gerald. He said it to his mother in the hallway outside the dining room, where he believed himself unheard. Edmund heard him. Edmund had been standing in the corridor for that precise purpose, because he had learned in his childhood that what his family believed unheard was invariably the only honest record of what his family believed. Gerald said, in a low, rapid voice, that he had been informed by a friend in Edinburgh, a friend who had been watching the matter since Carver's first letter 8 years ago, at Gerald's specific instruction, that the schoolmistress at the curate's house was not who she said she was. He said she was a beggar and a schemer who had attached herself to his name as a young girl and refused to release it, and that she had come to Wiltshire to extract money, and that something would have to be done. Edmund stepped into the corridor. Gerald went pale. "She is not a schemer," Edmund said, in the same level register he used for everything. "She is your wife, and the Edinburgh record will be in the vicar's hands before the soup is removed. The dinner was terrible, in the way that social catastrophes are terrible, quietly and in front of people who will discuss it for years." Carver had come from Edinburgh himself, which Edmund had not mentioned. He sat at the far end of the table next to the vicar, and he produced from a leather case the registration certificate and the banns, and a notarized deposition from both McCrae and Doward, and he handed these to the vicar in the middle of the second course, and the vicar put on his spectacles and read them, and the table watched the vicar's face, and the vicar's face told everyone what they needed to know before he said a single word. Mrs. Hartfield did not fragment. She was too controlled for that. What she did was sit absolutely still with her fan held at the precise height she always held it, and all the color moved out of her face and did not return. And the room watched this happen and understood that it was the worst thing they were likely to see at a dinner table this year, or perhaps the next. Gerald said nothing. There was nothing to say. Lady Cecilia sat beside him in white silk and looked at the tablecloth with the fixed attention of a woman who has discovered that the ground beneath a carefully constructed situation is less solid than represented, and is deciding, with admirable speed, how she feels about that. Edmund stood. He had not planned to stand. He had planned to allow the legal facts to speak for themselves and to limit his own role to the procedural. He stood, because Marian was not in the room, and because the room was beginning its collective reinterpretation of events in real time, and he was not willing to allow that reinterpretation to proceed in a direction the facts did not support. "The woman you have heard described as a village beggar," he said to the table, in a voice that carried without effort, "is Marian Hartfield. She is my brother's legal wife. She came to this county 6 months ago to establish the truth of that. She stood at the gate of this church on the morning of my brother's ceremony, and she did not enter, because she is a woman of finer judgment than anyone in this room has given her credit for. She has conducted herself throughout with a dignity that reflects considerable credit on her and considerable shame on this family. Her situation will be addressed in full, and I will not have her spoken of as anything other than what she is." He sat down. Mrs. Pemberton's fork remained suspended approximately 2 inches above her plate for an interval of some seconds. "She is my wife," he said, into the silence that followed, which was not quite right, and he corrected himself immediately, quietly, almost only to himself. "She is who she says she is, and she will be treated as such." But Mrs. Pemberton had heard the slip, and so had the vicar, and so had Colonel Pemberton. And the dinner moved on in the peculiar suspended way of a meal during which everyone present knows that several lives are being rearranged, and no one yet knows how they will settle. Marian was at the curate's house when he came, still in the plain dress she had worn all day. The fire burned low, the primers stacked on the table. He knocked, which she had not expected, because the men she had known in her life had not, on the whole, been knockers. She opened the door, and he was there in the cold, without his hat, which he had apparently forgotten in the manner of a man who had left a room with some speed and not fully completed his preparations for the outdoors. "It is done," he said. She stood in the doorway and looked at his face in the low light from the hall, and she said, "Come in out of the cold." And he came in, and she sat him down at the same kitchen table and the same chipped teapot and the same plain cups, and she poured, and he told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the dry precision that was her version of humor, and that he had become very fond of, "You forgot your hat." "I did," he said. "And you appear," she said carefully, "to have announced me to your mother's dinner table as your wife." He looked at her directly. "I corrected myself," he said. "You did," she said. "Eventually." The fire was low, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the frost had set in again, and the sycamores were bare in the dark, and she sat across from him at the small plain table with her hands wrapped around her cup, and the feeling that had been careful and contained for 3 weeks, and careful and contained for 3 years before that, and careful and contained for 8 years before that, was no longer being particularly carefully contained. "Marian," he said. She looked up. "I will not say what I am considering saying tonight," he said, "because you have had a considerable number of things happen today, and it would be poor timing, and I am attempting to be less impulsive than the occasion might suggest." She held his gaze. "What if I do not need you to be less impulsive?" He was quiet for a moment. "I should like to call on you. Properly. When the legal proceedings have run their course, and your situation is stable, and you are in a position to hear what I have to say, and refuse it if you choose to refuse it, without any sense of obligation." She considered this with the care she applied to all large things. "That is very correct of you," she said. "Yes," he said. And there was something almost like wry acknowledgement in the way he said it. "Edmund?" she said. "Yes." "I have been conducting myself correctly for 8 years," she said. "I am very good at it. I should like very much, at some point in the not very distant future, to stop." He looked at her for a long moment with the full weight of the thing he was carrying behind the composed face, and then he said quietly, "You will not have to conduct yourself correctly on my account." She set down her cup. He set down his. Outside, the wind, and the bare sycamores, and the November dark that had settled fully over Wiltshire while they were not paying attention to it. He did not say the rest of it that night. He said it 3 weeks later, in the lane behind the church on a morning when the first snow of winter had fallen and lay thin and even over the frozen fields, and he said it with the specificity she had come to expect of him. Her name first, then the question, then no elaboration because none was needed, and she said yes with the same economy. And he took her hand, her bare hand in the cold, and held it, and did not let go. The legal proceedings concluded in the spring. Carver was thorough, and the record was unimpeachable, and Gerald Hartfield's marriage to Lady Cecilia was dissolved by the ecclesiastical court in April, and Gerald removed himself to the continent shortly afterward, and Mrs. Hartfield retired to the dower house and was not seen at county dinners for some considerable time, and Lady Cecilia, whose intelligence had never been in question, departed for Bath with her settlement and her dignity intact, and was reported to be flourishing there. On a Thursday in June, Marian Hartfield sat in the drawing-room of what was, by then, her drawing-room as well, in a house that smelled of beeswax and old books, and the early roses that had come in through the open window from the garden that Edmund had told her, simply, to use as she liked. She was reading, because she was always reading. And the light was the warm yellow of summer afternoons in English houses, when the world outside has gone green and slow. Edmund was in the study, which she knew because she had learned the specific sound of his step, and of the study door when it was pulled to against the latch, and knowing where he was had become, in 6 months, one of the natural facts of the day. Like the light from the east window in the morning, and the coal settling in the grate at night. On the side table beside her chair sat a small framed miniature of a woman with a warm face and dark eyes. Georgiana. Marian had asked Edmund one evening whether it was difficult, and he had said, with the plainness she trusted, that it was not difficult in the way she might fear. That love was not a finite substance, and Georgiana was not a closed door, and the miniature sat where it sat because Georgiana had been real and would remain real, and that was a truth worth keeping in the room. Marian had looked at the miniature for a moment, and then at Edmund, and understood fully what manner of man she had married. She had not been wrong to stand at the Lich Gate. She had not been wrong to come to Wiltshire. She had been right about the thing she could not yet have named on that November morning, that the truth was worth standing in the cold for, that the cold would eventually end, that the standing was not the last thing she would ever do. The roses came in through the open window, and the light lay warm and even across the floor of the drawing-room, and somewhere in the hall a clock ticked steadily through the summer afternoon, and Marian Hartfield read her book, and the house was very quiet, and it was hers.